All right, good evening and welcome everybody to ARPA Canada's Bill C-6 Conversion Therapy webinar. So glad to have you on here. My name is Ed Hoogerdyk. I'm the Alberta Manager for ARPA Canada. I'm joined by ARPA's André Schutten, Dr. Gillies, and apologist Jojo Ruba, and I'll be introducing them shortly. Welcome to all of you. Also a special, I guess you want to call it a welcome to our backroom techie, Mr. Levi Minderhout, who's in the back, making sure that everything runs smoothly. I'm going to get to it right away. We have a lot to do here, lots of speeches to give and so forth. And so I'm going to begin with a Bible passage from Matthew 11 about Jesus being gentle and lowly in heart. It comes from the book Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortlund. When we talk about the issues tonight about Bill C-6, we're talking about those who are confused, those who are struggling, those who suffer, those who need help, and find sometimes that they don't have that help or don't have that hope. And of course, we know the one who can provide them that help, the only one, and that is our Savior, Jesus Christ. So Matthew 11, you'll recognize these words here. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I just want to read a very brief blurb from the book as well. Gentle and lowly, this, according to his own testimony, is Christ's very heart. This is who he is: tender, open, welcoming, accommodating, understanding, willing. If we are asked to say only one thing about who Jesus is, we would be honoring Jesus' own teaching if our answer is gentle and lowly. If Jesus hosted his own personal website, the most prominent line of the About Me dropdown would read, gentle and lowly in heart. And it's my prayer that when we leave this call, as weak as we are, that we would also show some of that gentleness and lowliness in heart to those who are, to those who struggle with gender issues and so forth. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Our gracious God, we come before you. We give you our praise. We give you our thanks that we can be here on this webinar. We thank you for everybody who has chimed in to listen. We thank you for our guest speakers. And we thank you most of all for our Savior, Jesus Christ, who is gentle and lowly in heart. And Lord, we pray for those who struggle, for those who are confused about gender. And we pray, O Lord, that you would turn them to you, that you would turn them to your Son, Jesus Christ. So, Father, may we learn and may we also leave with a new zeal to act, to speak up for truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we're going to get rolling right off the hop here. We have, of course, three panelists, three speakers, and I'm going to introduce the first one, and then we'll have the first presentation. And then after that's done, I'll introduce the other ones as we go along here. For those of you listening, I encourage you, if you think of a question to ask, put it in the Q&A box. Please put it in the Q&A box. I'll be able to see them. And once all the three presentations are done, I can read the questions off, and then the panelists can take a stab at providing the answers the best that they can. So our first speaker is going to be Mr. André Schutten. He is the Director of Law and Public Policy for ARPA Canada. He is ARPA Canada's General Legal Counsel. He researches, he writes, he lectures on things like public policy and constitutional and legal issues. He does regular analysis on government bills, and he also represents ARPA in various court interventions. He's been at the Supreme Court 3 times and also at the provincial appeal level 3 times as well. He's also a well-rounded young fellow. He is a former infantry reservist. He's a church organist. He sings in a really cool a cappella choir. He can fix your watch. He drinks a lot of water, which is probably why he looks so young. And when I go to the auto office, I feel like old Uncle Ed coming in. You're in for a real treat. André is going to speak to you about Caesar. Caesar is Gnostic and expects you to be too. and he's going to present the legal implications of Bill C-6 for the pastoral ministry of the church. André, the online floor is all yours, my friend.
All right. So, all right, sorry. So I just want to share my screen right away. So I have a PowerPoint, and let's see here. I gotta make sure. There's so many screens, you know, like it's all I got to make sure that I do it in a way that I still manage to stay on my Zoom call, and that I can also see my PowerPoint. So I'm trying to figure all that out. I think I got it here. So can you see my screen, Ed? I think it's going.
Yes, I see it here. You bet. You're
all
good
right,
to go.
perfect. Okay, so Caesar is Gnostic and expects you to be too. The legal implications of Bill C-6 and the ban on conversion therapy. Yeah, so conversion therapy, Bill C-6. So Bill C-6 is, so I'm going to, Ed said you're in for a delight. It's not going to be that, unfortunately. It's going to be a bit dry. It's going to be just the legal analysis of this bill. And so I have the sad duty of walking you through the dry part, and then Dr. Ann and Jojo are going to give you the more exciting part, because that's the real live issues that come out of this dry part. You got to understand the dry part to really appreciate the not so dry part. So Bill C-6 is so that's a bill. So if it passes through Parliament, it's working through Parliament now, it will become law. So it's not yet law, but it will become law if it passes through Parliament. Bill C-6 has certain religious, deeply religious assumptions built into it. And those assumptions come from a Gnostic religious worldview about human sexuality, human anthropology, what it means to be human, what it means to have a body and spirit, and how those relate, and so on. I won't be able to get into too much of it because we're very limited for time. You're going to have to take my word for it, but you're going to see it, I think, in the definition of conversion therapy that comes in Bill C-6. Okay, so in order to understand this bill, we have to first ask ourselves, well, what's conversion therapy? And when you think about conversion therapy, perhaps you think about it in this colloquial sense, in the sense that it is in pop culture, or if you're talking with somebody over the white picket fence or around the water cooler. Conversion therapy is, like this National Post article said, conversion therapy is this widely discredited range of methods that purport to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And this National Post article brings to mind ideas like electrical shock therapy, or shaming rituals, or aversion therapy, painful aversion therapy, where a person is shown a homoerotic image and then, hurt or inflicted with pain of some sort in order to try to force that person to change their sexual orientation from homosexual to heterosexual, right? And these are long discredited. And if that's the type of conversion therapy we're talking about, shucks, we'll write the law for you. We'll happily ban that kind of conversion therapy. In fact, that's exactly what ARPA Canada, together with a number of other lawyers and organizations, did at the beginning of last year, is we drafted a law to ban conversion therapy for the consideration of the Justice Department. How does Bill C-6 define it, though? What's the problem if we're okay with banning conversion therapy? What's the problem with Bill C-6? Well, the problem with Bill C-6 is that it defines conversion therapy quite a bit differently, quite a lot more broadly. This is the definition in Bill C-6. It's a big mouthful, and then I'll walk you through it. All right. So conversion therapy means a practice, treatment, or service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, to change a person's gender identity or gender expression to cisgender, or to repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior or non-cisgender gender expression. For greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration and development of an integrated personal identity without favoring any particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. That's a huge mouthful. Let's break it down. All right, let's break it down. Conversion therapy means, first, a practice, treatment, or service. Okay, so It's not very specific, this definition, is it? It's a practice, any practice, not a therapeutic practice, not a coercive practice, not even the practice of doing certain things. Rather, it's a practice, which when you read a bill like this, or read a law like this, that means it's any practice, treatment, or service. All right, and it's specifically a treatment service designed for something. What is it designed for? Well, there's three things in this definition. It's designed for changing a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual. So change is a big part of that. You could use the word, that's where the conversion comes from, right? To change, and specifically in one direction, to heterosexual. So from homosexual to heterosexual, from LGBTQ to SI to heterosexual. Or to change a person's gender identity or gender expression to cisgender. Now that term cisgender is a new term in law. It's the first time it's used in federal law that I know of. It's certainly the first time it's being used in the criminal code. And what that term means is this idea, it identifies a person whose sense of gender or sense of self correlates with their biological reality. So for example, I would be a cisgender person because my sense of myself as male matches my biological body. So that's cisgender. And so it's this is dealing with the question of, gender expression. Transgender would be the opposite of a cisgender. And then the third one, though, is a practice designed to repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior or non-cisgender gender expression. Okay, so even just trying a practice that's designed to reduce non-heterosexual sexual behavior is considered by this bill conversion therapy. So what's an example of reducing non-heterosexual sexual behavior? Well, if you have a person that that's struggling with a pornography addiction, if that pornography addiction happens to be heterosexual pornography, then they're allowed to get help to reduce that behavior. But if it happens to be homosexual pornography, then you can't get help to reduce that sexual behavior because, according to this bill anyway, that might fall foul of conversion therapy. It might be defined as conversion therapy because it's particularly concerned with non-heterosexual sexual behavior. Likewise, even a practice that's designed to reduce non-cisgender gender expression would be defined as conversion therapy. So what is non-cisgender gender expression? Well, that's expressing your gender in a way that's different from the biological sex that you are. So this actually depends on, in an ironic sort of way, this definition depends on gender stereotypes, doesn't it? Because you have to have a gender stereotype in order to figure out what a cisgender gender expression is, in order to criminalize the non-cisgender gender expression, or the reduction of it, or the repression of that, right? And so, for example, the example I've been giving is that, look, I've got a son and I've got a daughter, and if I have a rule in my house or a practice in my house that children are not to use or experiment with makeup, like nail polish or lipstick or eyeshadow, that would be okay to have that practice as it relates to my daughter, because that's a stereotypical female beauty product. But if my son wanted to experiment with lipstick or eyeshadow or nail polish, well, then that could possibly be considered a practice that's trying to reduce the behavior or the non-cisgender gender expression. So you see right there, there's actually some weird stereotypes playing into this definition, okay? But the definition doesn't end there. It says, no, conversion therapy means this practice designed to change sexual orientation, change gender identity or gender expression, or even to reduce non-heterosexual sexual behavior or non-cisgender behavior or expression. And then they add a clarifying clause, which is not clarifying all that much at all. In fact, for some of us, it seems to muddy the waters even more. The clarifying section says, for greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration and development of an integrated personal identity without favoring a particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So this is an interesting clarifying statement. First of all, I'll note that I think I like this phrase, the integrated personal identity, because it's a recognition, at least, that the Parliament recognizes that our personal identities are actually pretty complex. It's an integration of different aspects of our personal identity, isn't it? I mean, for myself, I have a personal identity that relates to my relationship with my wife. I'm a husband. Or relationship to my children. I'm a father. My relationship to my parents. I'm a son. My relationship to my religion. I'm a Christian. My occupation. I'm a lawyer. My national membership. I'm a Canadian, right? So my personal identity is an integrated one. There's lots of aspects to it. But then it kind of undoes the good of that phrase with what follows, where it says, without favoring any particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And so it's a neutered clarifying term, because what happens if you're a person who actually wants to prioritize certain aspects of their personal identity that aren't their sexual orientation or isn't their gender identity, and yet the other identity might have implications for their sexual orientation or gender identity. In other words, if I identify first as a Christian, which I do, my first and my primary identity rests in the person and work of Jesus Christ. His name is on me as a Christian, and that's going to shape everything else about me, how I'm a husband and how I'm a father and how I'm a lawyer and the way I act as a Canadian. That's all shaped by my identity in Jesus Christ. Well, the same thing with people, with every Christian who wants to shape their sexuality and their sense of identity around their gender, their sexuality, their sexual ethics, and so on. They shape that in accordance with their identity in Jesus Christ, and they need to be able to find people that walk alongside them to explore that together. But again, would that not be a form of favoring a particular outcome as it relates to orientation or identity? It might. So it becomes a very problematic definition, doesn't it? Okay, so we've got that definition, and that's how this bill defines conversion therapy. But what's the actual criminal offense that would be passed? Well, the criminal offense is fourfold. There's four things, and it should be on your screen now. So the first offense is that conversion therapy, that big broad idea of conversion therapy, is illegal if there's no consent among adults, which is not all that problematic, because we wouldn't be supporting non-consensual therapies and counseling sessions anyway, right? Adults should be able to consent to that kind of stuff. So that's not really a problem. It's number 2, 3, and 4 that's a problem. Number 2 is causing any child under the age of 18 to undergo conversion therapy, whether that's here in Canada or internationally. And that's punishable by up to 5 years in prison. And so here, imagine again, like a 16 or 17-year-old person who's, struggling with homosexual porn, let's say, looking for help to conquer that, to reduce that particular type of behavior. That could be considered a crime under this bill, right? Advertising or promoting conversion therapy. So promotion means not just paid advertising. Promotion means, you post a supportive statement on your Facebook page about an experience. Maybe you've had a positive experience with a counselor. That could be considered a promotion of conversion therapy. And material benefit from conversion therapy is also would be a crime. So that means making a salary or being paid in any way to do to provide conversion therapy, this big broad sense of conversion therapy, which would include talk therapy and so on. Okay, so and a quick note that in the criminal code, the offense doesn't just mean doing the deed. So it doesn't just mean the advertising of conversion therapy or doing conversion therapy. It also means attempting to do it, or attempting to advertise, or attempting to promote it, and so on. It means aiding somebody else to do it. It means counseling somebody else to do it, or it means being an accessory after the fact. So an offense is broader than just doing the deed. Now, this bill obviously raises all kinds of pastoral concerns, and Dr. Ann and Jojo are going to speak much more about that. But our number one concern that I want to emphasize is the well-being of vulnerable children. All children and all Canadians need to be able to have good access to good help, and this bill actually ends up capturing good help for children and seeks to criminalize it or suppress it. And that means vulnerable children lose out. It's also going to impact on the spread and the whole application of the gospel to the whole person. And finally, it's going to impact on parental relationships and responsibilities, the relationship between parents and their own kids. All of these are big concerns for us. In the culture that we're in today, it's teaching young people that there's no such thing as girls and boys. It's creating a lot of confusion around identity, around questions of belonging, around questions of what does it mean to be human, how should I live, and so on. In the midst of this culture with these confusing ideas, we need to be free to share the gospel. And the gospel message is a beautiful one. And that message is that you as an individual are a completely unique, beautiful person. You are made by God in the image of God, and he made you either male or female, and he created you for a wonderful purpose. And we, the church, love you and we cherish you and we want to help you flourish. And we need the freedom to be able to do that. So that's our primary concern around Bill C-6. That's a bit of a really quick legal analysis of the problematic parts of the bill. I'm going to turn it over back to Ed to introduce the next speaker.
All right, Andre, thank you so much for that. We're going to get right to the next speaker, which is Dr. Ann Gillies. Dr. Gillies is trained jointly in professional counseling and theology. She has a PhD in the philosophy of professional counseling, and her research revolves around same-sex attraction, gender dysphoria, and conversion therapy. That's why we have her on the call. I chuckle at the next part of this bio because it says she recently retired. I think you have to edit that, Anne, because I think I don't think you're anywhere near that. You seem to be going strong still. She has taught courses on counseling skills and marriage. She has a couple of books, Deep Impact, Treatment of Complex Trauma, another one called Closing the Floodgates, Setting the Record Straight on Gender and Sexuality, and she's in the process of writing her third book, which again proves she's not retiring quite yet, and has a working title of While We Were Sleeping. She's married to Bob. Together they have 6 children and 12 wonderful grandchildren who all fuel her passion to keep up the fight on the subject of conversion therapy. You can reach her through her website. We'll mention it later in the call as well, restoringthemosaic.ca. Anne is going to talk to us about the effect of criminalizing talk therapy on professional therapists, on pastoral counselors, on lay leaders, and also the challenge for parents under a bill like Bill C-6 to find proper counseling care for their confused and struggling children. Dr. Ann, it's so great to have you on the call. And yeah, the online floor is all yours now.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for that introduction. No, I'm not retired, really, just retired from practicing therapy. But yeah, I'm going to share my screen here. So let me just pull this up, and we'll walk through this explanation. Now, again, it's very quick, 10 minutes isn't very long. So I hope to touch on all of the things that Ed was talking about. So Bill C-6 actually discriminates against particular sexual minority, and it is complicit in forcing therapists and pastoral counselors, mental health workers to discriminate against this sexual minority, the same-sex attracted who are not wanting or desiring to continue down that road. They have unwanted same-sex attraction, and also the gender dysphoric, those who are gender expressive in changing their gender toward a transgender. We cannot help those individuals if they come asking for help. And believe me, they come asking for help. So as a psychotherapist, you know, one of the things that I loved was that I was privileged to work with individuals from all walks of life. And any therapists that are on this call will feel the same way. Those who are pastors and pastoral counselors, you walk with people all the time. You know, our job is to join with the client in their journey of exploration and healing. We don't get to dictate the direction of their journey. Now, you know, sometimes, well, and what we hear, certainly from activists, is that they have been very wounded by the church, that they're angry, very angry over their experiences in the church. And, you know, there's some truth to that. They felt ostracized. Well, I want to tell you that I felt, when I, like, all eyes on me at times, but one particular time in my life when I walked into church, and I've been away from church for a while, and there'd been some stuff happening, and I'll tell you, you can feel like all eyes are on you. And, you know, for the LGBTQ particularly, they haven't really been understood by the church in large, up until, I would say, perhaps the last 20 years. I think the church has really moved in the direction of welcoming them, welcoming everyone. But God has certain requirements of us, and for each individual, and certainly when regards to sexual relationships. So we don't get to dictate the direction of their journey, but it's also not the therapist's responsibility to weed out who we can and cannot serve. You know, we want to help clients to identify the current circumstance that they're experiencing and their past experiences and how those interact. That's part of our job. We need to examine their perceptions, challenge their distortions, help them express their emotions, and to explore their options. So this bill actually doesn't allow us to do any of that anymore, unless we are helping them on the trajectory toward either homosexuality, well, bisexual, pansexual, polyamory, but homosexual, or a gender identity. We need to give clients accurate and helpful information. That's what therapists are supposed to do. We're supposed to be honest, quite honestly. And that information helps identify unhealthy patterns of behavior. And then we develop plans to help change those behaviors that the individual is wanting to change. And there is abundant literature out there that supports talk therapy, change allowing therapy for the same sex attracted who have unwanted attractions, for those who come to us with those unwanted attractions. So the therapy is all about client-directed change. And Bill C-6 prevents all of the practices I've just talked about for this specific group of people. Therapists will no longer be able to assist these individuals to manage or alleviate sex-related concerns. And André just touched on this a little bit, but for instance, if a young man, I'll say young man, has intrusive sexual thoughts and fantasies in the workplace, in the classroom, amongst his relatives, you know, there's all kinds of places and things that happen, intrusive thoughts, and sometimes they're very they just are spontaneous, but sometimes they become very, very regular, and people don't want to have those, so they go to counseling. We can't help them with that if those thoughts are toward homosexuality. People come to reduce casual sex with multiple partners. And if it's a heterosexual individual, then we can help them, but we are not allowed to help a bisexual or a homosexual, gay or lesbian. So it's very, very directive, this bill, and it's very discriminatory. We can't help them to reduce their inabilities to remain sexually faithful. When I talk about the individuals with unwanted same-sex attraction, there are a lot of such people. I mean, percentage-wise, perhaps not a lot, but within our churches, a significant portion that have unwanted same-sex attraction, and they are married often. And they do not want those thoughts. They want to be faithful to their spouse. They don't want to act on those thoughts, but we won't be able to help them reach their goal of remaining faithful. Bill C-6 also prevents help to reduce pornographic materials, even violent materials, if it's in the direction of homosexual porn. And it also prevents the help to reduce compulsivity in sexual activities, so addictive behaviors, sexual addictions in the area of homosexuality. And that's a big issue for many who have lived in the community and then later leave the LGBT community. And one of the things that they constantly talk about, especially gay men, not so much the lesbians, but gay men particularly, is the addiction, sexually addicted, and the multiple partners. We can't help them reduce sexual fantasies or and fetishes and related behaviors if it's toward heterosexuality. And you can't help them with the inability to say no to another partner's sexual advances if that partner is homosexual. So we have a problem with Bill C-6, to say the least. As written, this bill will be directly responsible for physical, psychological, emotional, and other damage that's suffered by Canadian members of a sexual minority due to the lack of access to therapeutic supports. And this is something that, from a psychological perspective, from a mental health perspective, is really intolerable. It should never be allowed. And it's a disgrace that the American and Canadian psychological associations have both agreed to ban so-called conversion therapy, talk therapy, for unwanted same-sex attraction. It's a huge disgrace. And it's a big disgrace as well that psychologists, psychiatrists, and mental health workers have gone along with it and not spoken up. But let's talk about minors just quickly. They should not be excluded from receiving care. Undesired, uncontrolled, and otherwise harmful sexual thoughts, feelings, attractions, and behaviors do not conveniently wait to the age of majority to manifest in the minds of young people, young Canadians. So, and especially now with the aggressive sex ed that we're seeing in the school, younger and younger children are exhibiting sexual behaviors that we would never have thought we would see in young children on the playground. And we're going to get to the point that now, and we are there already, of course, that we can't help these children if they don't want to have those feelings and attractions. You know, the parents really are the forgotten casualties. Parents must be ensured of their right to parent their minor children according to their established values and beliefs, and not be forced to adapt their values and beliefs to the unsubstantiated thoughts and ideas of children who have been subjected to these new cultural ideologies. And we need to stand firm, and it's going to be very hard for parents. It's hard now. It's very hard in the public school system to stand firm, and children have been indoctrinated to believe that every kind of relationship, they're all equally normal, they're all equally good. And that in itself is not actual truth-telling. So we need to pursue facts, not feelings. Your sex is predetermined in utero. Doctors can make a person look different through surgery, but they can't actually change the biological reality of that person. There is no medical baseline for how do you know that you're a transgender, transsexual. How do you know? And, you know, allowing a thought, feeling, a delusion to dictate legislation is exactly what's been happening. And it's the aggressive activists that have been pushing it. Transitioning does not fix mental health for these young people. It makes it worse. And there's good studies now coming out that substantiate that, but they're not being listened to. I wanted to share quickly one man's journey and the denying of reality of surgery, because what has happened is that we don't tell our young people what to expect if they begin with puberty blockers, and then they will go to hormone therapy, and most likely, for many of them, at least some level of surgery. So let me share this journey. He had 7 surgeries. He experienced pulmonary embolism, which is a blockage of the pulmonary artery in the lung, not the heart. He had an induced stress, heart attack, 17 months of reoccurring infections, 16 rounds of antibiotics, 3 weeks of daily IV antibiotics, complete hair loss, loss of his arm function, arm reconstructive surgery. He had bladder damage, insomnia, hallucinations, encountered PTSD from all of this, and he was in the US, over $1 million in medical expenses. He lost his job, his home, his family, his career, his marriage. And he says, I'm a hybrid. This is one trans man's journey. He was a girl. And you know why this all started? Because in his family, all the boys were athletes. And so as a little girl, he found that everyone seemed to really pay attention to these boys who were athletes. And so he thought, she, at that point, thought that perhaps she should be a boy. And so all his life that ruminated. You know, when thoughts take over your mind, and all of us have had them, that if we give into delusional thoughts, that our minds will just run wild. And that's what's happening in our society. Evidence is now coming out, though, of rush diagnoses for the gender expressed children, and particularly for young girls with what's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. You can find more on that on my website. There's a pressure from doctors and therapists to prescribe life-changing harmful drugs with lifelong ramifications. These are experimental medications. And then from that, it goes to recommendations of mutilation by having double mastectomies, genital surgeries, and all of these are being examined after a parliamentary inquiry in the UK, and a successful case of Curabell against the Tavistock Clinic. And Curabell, and I'll be very quick with this last little bit, at 16, she was transitioning, she had a double mastectomy, and now in her late 20s, she has detransited, and she took Tavistock Clinic, Gender Clinic, to court and won, saying that she was not told of the long-term effects of all the medications and the surgeries. I really do predict, and I have said this for the last 3 or 4 years, a proliferation of lawsuits in the coming years, lawsuits against doctors, against clinics, against teachers, and others who are pushing this agenda on our children. Thanks so very much for listening. I'll just get off my screen share and give it back to Ed. Thanks,
Super.
Ed.
Thanks so much, Anne. We're going to jump next to apologist Jojo Ruba. Jojo is the communications director for Free to Care, freetocare.ca. We'll share that a bit later as well. He's personally experienced positive counseling for unwanted same-sex attractions and behavior, and it's a counseling that he argues would be made illegal under Bill 6 if it's passed. He earned a Bachelor of Journalism and Masters in Political Science from Carleton University. And a couple of fun facts. He lives only 5 minutes from me, and he recently introduced me to Jollibee Chicken. If you've not had Jollibee Chicken, folks, you don't know what you're missing. So Jojo, happy to have you here. He's going to share how Christians can prepare their churches for when Bill C-6 becomes law, starting with the need to find our identity in our Savior and not in our sexuality. Jojo, you're up.
Thank you, Ed, and thanks, ARPA, for hosting this. Thank you for all of you for joining us on a Wednesday evening. I know it's getting late here in Alberta already, But this is so important that you're part of this conversation, because if you don't realize the ramifications of this bill, as Andre and Dr. Ann have already mentioned, we will not be able to move forward as a Christian community with the same kind of freedoms. And what's important here too, as Christians, I've always advocated for the idea that we're not just here to fight for our own rights, but for us to be able to articulate a common good, one that everyone benefits from. You know, as some of you know too, I run a Christian apologetics ministry. I'm the director of a Christian apologetics ministry called Faith Beyond Belief. And we're very focused on helping Christians understand what a biblical worldview looks like and how to articulate that worldview well to the culture around us. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about that was when I was in university, I was part of a campus Christian club and was leading several Bible study groups. And in one of the groups, I began to realize I was feeling very strong attractions to one of the members of our Bible study group. And I had to begin to process what that meant, or what this was that I was feeling. And the challenge for me was it was a men's Bible study group. And I began to realize I had to deal with these kinds of attractions or feelings. I couldn't just ignore them any longer. And so I went to the leader of our Christian club, and she gave me information on how to contact Christian counselors, professional Christian counselors, to help me process this. And the counseling wasn't perfect. A lot of the counselors at that time didn't have the same kind of knowledge that, say, Dr. Ann does, but it was still very helpful. And I met several counselors along the way over the many years that I lived in Ottawa and then moved here in Calgary. And one of the things that I was able to learn from those counselors was, at the end of the day, I do not have to identify with my sexual attractions or sexual behavior. I can identify with what my Savior sees me at. And I've been chaste and celibate, and I'm really, really grateful for that, because of the support that I've been able to get with those Christian counselors. See, this ban would prevent people like me, who are not coerced, who are not being forced, who want this support. In fact, my parents didn't even know at the time that I was getting this counseling. It would prevent people like me from getting that kind of service. As someone asked a question already, free counseling is technically allowed, but paid counseling is not for adults. And for anyone under 18, no counseling is allowed that would reduce non-heterosexual or non-cisgender behavior. And that's key, because, as Andre said, the definition of conversion therapy that's used by the government is not used by any medical or professional body. By adding the phrase reduction of non-heterosexual behavior, the government now is trying to tell us what behavior we can or cannot engage in. And as Dr. Ann mentioned, what happens now in counseling sessions is they would have to ask, what kind of sexual attraction or sexual behavior are you dealing with? And if it's non-heterosexual, they could not help a consenting patient or client reduce that behavior. And there are multiple reasons why people would want to change or reduce that behavior. Things like, if they get married and they don't want to have sexual encounters with anyone outside of their spouse, their counseling session and the marriage counseling could not reduce non-heterosexual sexual behavior. And for me as a Christian, and I would say there's people in your church who deal with this, we prioritize our identity in Christ first. Not because we think that are these attractions no longer exist. Sometimes they still do. But because we realize these attractions are something that we have, it is not something that we are. And part of what we need to understand in even just walking through this is the huge ramifications, not just for people in my situation, but people in your church and people in Canada in general. So let me share my screen as well. And I want to walk you through a bit of what needs to be dialogued about. We only have, again, 10 minutes today, but I really want to be able to show you that there is much we can do and much we need to prepare for in terms of where our culture is going. So as part of sharing my life, I was invited to speak at an apologetics conference in Ottawa at the Dig and Delve conference. You can look up their website here. And I was just sharing my testimony, sharing personally what I've gone through to show that we can have a biblical worldview on sexuality, live according to the Bible's teachings on sex, that it should only be reserved for husband and wife in marriage, and still show compassion to the LGBTQ community by engaging them thoughtfully and biblically. But even that wasn't enough for the activists who are pushing to have these kinds of laws passed. This man, Andrew Hill, actually posted that my presentation, which he had not seen when he posted this, caused violence against the LGBTQ community, and we have blood on our hands for simply hosting my presentation. Now, Andrew Hill is actually a church planter of all things, not just a Christian or someone who claims to be a Christian. He's a church planter starting a church in Ottawa. And this speaks to me how critical it is for us to understand the battle is not even outside the church. The battle is now happening in the church. And I know the Reformed community is very strong on worldview training, and I really appreciate that. The problem is, I know of even a Reformed church here in Calgary that is pushing this LGBTQ narrative and a revisionist view of what the Bible teaches. And that's why I think it's critical for us to lay out a strategy on how we can communicate the biblical worldview on sexuality. But we need more than a communication strategy. What we really need is a conversation strategy. We need to be able to think through how we can converse on these issues with our friends, with our family members, and yes, even in the church. So let me give you 3 things to think about when we create a conversation strategy. First, we need conversations within the church about how serious this is. We need to acknowledge that this is a very difficult situation because we are now facing a hostile culture. Now, we have a lot of great rights that we need to protect, but at the same time, these rights are being questioned in culture. When I mentioned this, one of the challenges we have is that inside the church, we have people like Andrew Hill who are actually advocating against a biblical worldview. This woman here, Rose Ingrid Benjamin, she actually posted this live video on Facebook while my presentation was taking place in Ottawa. So clearly she wasn't watching the presentation. Otherwise, how could she have commented on it in an educated way? She couldn't have. But this is what she said. Listen to what she considers conversion therapy as she's complaining about a talk she didn't even watch.
What do we say to those people who are like, well, no, it's my religious freedom? I'm like, yeah, but these Bible studies, these support groups aren't support groups, right? These Bible studies they're like Trojan horses to get people to change. And that, I think, in many ways, is some of the most nefarious stuff out there because it's harder to pinpoint, it's harder to legislate against, it's harder to stop, right? Like, how do you stop? Or when pastors read through the Bible and go, well, this week we're reading from Romans, and they start talking about like, oh yeah, if you sleep with a woman who sleeps with a woman or a man who sleeps with a man, you're an abomination.
Yeah. That
is abuse. And so I think that's one of the areas where there's a huge battle, and we're gonna have a harder time, like properly legislating and stopping it.
So you notice what she said there? Her response is reading through Romans, a pastor preaching through Romans could be a form of abuse. And the first reaction to that abuse is to create legislation against it. Now, it's easy enough to say, okay, well, this is just a person on the internet, she's saying a lot of things that are not making sense. But here's the challenge, right? And Andre was alluding to this. These conversion therapy bans are built on complaints. And you don't have to be the one getting counseled to be the one complaining. You can just overhear or see an advertisement for it to complain, and the person you complain against would go to jail if they're proven to have done conversion therapy. So their definition of conversion therapy matters because they're the ones who are listening. Look, like I said, they complain about my talk, which it wasn't about conversion therapy, and claimed it was conversion therapy. And so they could now claim, if this law had been in place, that what we did at the church by hosting my testimony is now conversion therapy, and have that church and anyone associated with that be filed against criminal charges against those organizations simply for having me do this presentation. That's the situation that we're facing. And that's why we need to recognize these definitions truly matter. And not only that, worldview matters, because the assumption in her talk, in her presentation, is disagreeing with her view on sexuality is now hate, is now abuse. You see that? And as Christians, if we are not able to articulate our worldview well on these issues and to defend ourselves, explain ourselves, to translate the biblical view, we will have a hard time living in a culture and maintaining a biblical worldview. And that's why for us, some of you have seen our resource, but I really recommend it, not just because it's our resource, because it's the project I think that we all need to go through. 13 lessons that we put together called the Identity Project on how we can navigate through this conversation. As Ed said, one of the key challenges we want to be able to give is to help you understand and help our culture understand our sexuality does not have to be our identity. It may be something that we have, it is not something that we are. And in fact, this weekend, we're in Grand Prairie speaking there, and we put together a half-day to full-day seminar on what churches can do to prepare for this ban, what they can do with their statement of faith or with their teachings or their hiring policies. All of these things I think are critical to start planning now, because even if the law isn't in place, we have to prepare for it, because these are the kinds of people who are pushing for this law. Let me get my 2 more points here and then we'll get questions. We need to have conversations with our political leaders about how seriously we take this. And right now I can tell you I'm in the process of meeting with elected leaders to be able to help shape the language that's there. So one of the MPs that I spoke to that I thought was really helpful on this was that he actually said, it's key for, it's critical to have pastors call MPs, and this is a friendly MP. It call MPs and have them meet with those MPs from a church that's in their riding. So if you know your local MP, and by the way, if a lot of you in Alberta and BC, if you have a conservative MP, right now we only have about 30 to 40 MPs who are willing to vote against Bill C-6. That's less than a third or so of the caucus of the Conservative Party. And that's very important for us, I think, to get the majority of the caucus, or at least a good chunk of it, in order for us to be avoided as ignoramuses or extremists. We need to have more. So right now, we know that this bill won't be dealt with until at least the 22nd of February. You can still spend time meeting with your MP. And this MP that I spoke to said, all these MPs are at home anyway, doing Zoom meetings. So in terms of adding a Zoom meeting, especially if it's a church leader, someone represents a group of people in his riding or her riding, this is a good time to be part of that conversation. And one of the things that we've created as a resource is, again, our website walks through all kinds of things you can do to talk to your MP, freetocare.ca /blog, or there's even a section there that says what you can do. We've created 5 videos even that you can watch that goes through all the arguments you're hearing tonight. They're about 10 minutes each. The challenge is to get this in front of the MPs, because right now, and this is, again, another MP said this, she said, most MPs simply do not understand what's at stake. They don't, and they get the information when they do the debate, not beforehand. But if one of you highlight this, one of their constituents highlights this, it will wake them up and help them understand they have to do something and at least create a redefinition of this bill, right? And that's really key for us to be able to get that information out. Information is key here. The last thing that we need to be able to do is we need to have a long-term strategic plan, because our opponents have had one. We need a long-term strategic plan because our opponents have had one for quite a while. You see, this ban that we're dealing with right now is just one of the first steps. We already know that what their plan is to be able to take this ban to argue that groups like ours do conversion therapy, even though we don't do that because of how they define conversion therapy, as André said. And then they can begin to remove the charitable status of groups like ours and churches like yours. And again, I'm not making this up. This is a clip from a radio station in Edmonton by Dr. Chris Wells. Chris Wells is an Edmonton area professor who has been the driving force behind the bylaws here in Alberta and the law in Ottawa. It's almost exactly the same wording. Listen to what he says.
What a bylaw does in a municipality is it not only maybe has fines and can strip away a business license, but what it does is it tells people that if this is happening in your community, report it. There's going to be a mechanism to help address it. But I agree that all levels of government need to be taking action on conversion therapy. The federal government has made a commitment. Just last week, I had a meeting with others and Justice Minister Lametti and said that they are absolutely going to criminalize conversion therapy. So
met with the justice minister?
A group of people from the LGBT community.
But you were in that group?
I was in.
And in person, he said that to you?
In person, and also look at stripping away charitable status from any organization that practices it.
Now we're talking. Marfus and Peace River.
Let me ask you, Chris, did the minister want you to reveal?
Doesn't matter. He didn't make me sign a confidentiality agreement.
Yeah.
But
and then once you remove the charitable status from organizations that so-called do conversion therapy, or what they deem as torture or coercion, then it's easy to criminalize those organizations. And that is definitely on their agenda. And so we need to recognize this is the long-term strategy. What is the church doing to prepare for this? What are we asking our leaders to prepare for this? How do we understand that this is not just one of those issues, another social issue we're dealing with? This is at the heart of the gospel. If you remember what the lady said earlier, she's saying she's complaining because the gospel demands that we change. Well, guess what? So what? That's exactly what Jesus demands of us, because that's what real love does. Real love doesn't just accept you as you are. It demands that you become a better person. In fact, the gospel demands that we become like Christ. And it doesn't matter what our sexual identity or sexual orientation or feelings or attractions or whatever, our race or gender, all of those things are secondary identities to our identity in Christ. And I think it's critical for us to be able to start having these questions now, knowing full well that's the agenda moving forward. Let me say one more thing, and then I'll pass it on back to Ed. We have this powerful opportunity, if there's someone out there who can help us, to actually collect information through a poll done by Angus Reid. And Angus is willing to do a poll on conversion therapy for us, but we need your help to raise $15,000 to help us get this poll out. And the poll would come out at the same time as the debate that's going on in Parliament. At least that's our plan. We need to get the money in as soon as possible. And that's what's really critical here, I think is key, is most Canadians do not realize how many people are benefiting from counseling that helps them reduce unwanted sexual behavior. Doesn't matter if it's gay or straight or whatever. But because that's something that's under the radar, most people like myself who get counseling for unwanted non-heterosexual attractions will not talk about it openly. And that's why they can get away with saying these kinds of things. Chris Wells compares people like me to drunk drivers who shouldn't be allowed to consent to getting counseling or consent to getting support. That's how low they think of us. The city of Calgary's lawyers even said people like me simply don't exist. So this is the situation when we need to change that narrative. And if you could help us do that, we'd really appreciate that change. You can contact us again at free2care.ca. And we look forward to the questions that you have. Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you, Jojo, and thanks again, Andre and Anne. Thank you, all of you. I'll take very briefly off the reaching out to MPs. I've been privileged to have some lobby meetings. Jojo and I have been on some lobby meeting calls with MPs and senators as well, with other pastors and church leaders. So if it's a daunting thing for you to organize your own lobby meeting, Zoom meeting, feel free to reach out and also reach out to other friends, because there sometimes is some strength in numbers and you might not feel as fearful. All right, we're going to get right to questions. Andre and Anne, I hope you've been sipping on your Red Bull because you're at 11 o'clock your time. We've got lots of questions here, so I'm going to get to it right away. This question is addressed to Andre. Would voluntary counseling for children be allowed? And if so, can children even consent to this? Also, given that a UK court recently decided they are unable to consent, I think, to certain medical treatments in this context.
Yeah, so according to Bill C-6, voluntary, even if a child, 16, 17, whatever, consents to, this broad definition of conversion therapy. So let's say it's pastoral counseling for an unwanted sexual attraction. That doesn't matter. That consent, this bill says that consent doesn't matter. It's criminal. Consent or no, it's criminal. Now, in law in Canada, there's the mature minor doctrine that in health law says that teenagers can consent to certain types of medical treatment, counseling, and so on. And it's a, it's a pretty complex area of law, but basically it's not uncommon for 16, 17, even 13, 14, 15-year-olds to consent to particular types of treatment. But this criminal bill would say across the board, if you're 17 or younger, it doesn't matter if you consent, it's still criminal. Now, the UK decision is quite interesting in that in the UK, they found that children under the age of 16 likely couldn't consent to things like like transitioning from biological female to male, particularly as it relates to opposite sex hormones and surgery, because they'd be too young to fully appreciate the impact on them into adulthood, right? It's a 13, 14, 15-year-old girl is going to have a hard time understanding the impact of what the surgical removal of her breasts means for her for the rest of her life. That means you cannot reverse that ever. That means she wouldn't be able to probably wouldn't be able to carry a child because of the hormones, and certainly wouldn't be able to breastfeed a child ever. Can a 13-year-old consent to that kind of a thing? And the UK court said no, or very, very much not likely. They did allow for cases like that to come to court in order to get a special permission from court, but otherwise not to happen. So unfortunately, though, that UK decision is only for the UK. It doesn't, it might have some persuasive effect here in Canada, but certainly doesn't have binding effect here.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question, does the material benefit clause only apply to children's therapy or also adult therapy? And if the latter, would it not mean that all professional therapy is outlawed, even if it is voluntarily sought by an adult? I'm glad you guys have gone here to answer these questions.
Yeah, so that material benefit is across the board, so even for adults. So yeah, in effect, it is outlawing professional therapy, but not quite. It's basically in effect making it unavailable, because they're basically saying if it's consenting adult and it hasn't been advertised and you're not making any money on it, then yeah, it's okay. But yeah, that means professional counselors that need to put bread on the table and so on, when, like maybe they'd be able to set up, help a few people, but if that's their, if that's how they're employed, then that's obviously going to be a problem. So.
Okay, we'll jump to the next one. I know the concerns about restricting desired therapy have been shared with the Justice Committee. Has that been ignored, or is the consenting adult permission supposed to take care of it? I open it up to anybody. You want me to repeat one more time? Or did you get that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, so the Justice Minister did speak to this specifically during the hearing at the committee as well, at the Justice Committee, where he said, like the NDP, for example, have been pushing to say, no, we got to criminalize even consensual adult conversion therapy, which would include like pastoral counseling and so on. Even if adults consent, he said, still make it criminal. Because as NDP MB Randall Garrison said, it's akin to torture, and you can't consent to torture, so you shouldn't be able to consent to talk therapy for unwanted same-sex attraction. A bit of a leap there, but anyway. And so the Justice Minister said, well, the charter, it requires us to allow for consensual type things between adults, so he felt that they would have to leave that alone for adults. So yeah, I think that's why that's there, but I welcome feedback from Jojo or Ann on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the caveat is it's only free counseling you can get, not paid. So what I got would be criminal. If if there's any compensation, so for example, Colette, one of her colleagues, she paid for her counseling through her university student fees. That would likely be criminal as well, because it's paid counseling. So the only way we can get around that, and this is very problematic, would be to get free counseling. But if advertising is banned as well, then we wouldn't be able to get advertising or find these counseling agencies to do it. And just to share, we've already called 12 or so counseling agencies here in Calgary and mentioned the bylaw particularly, and all of them said no, they can't provide counseling to help reduce non-heterosexual behavior. And as Dr. Ann, if you want to jump in here, that kind of goal is actually a contradiction. It says in the law itself, you can't have a directional counseling. It has to be open exploration. But then in the definition, it says but it can't be reduction. So that's a direction. It's a direct contradiction. And that's not what counselors are supposed to do, right, Dr. Ann?
That's exactly it. Like, this is so draconian, and I think, Andre, what you were talking about, it's not really clear as far as what consenting adults actually can receive. But because of all of the legislation against advertising of any kind, so whether that's on your website or anything, like, how would other than someone at a church, a congregant who would go to their pastor and in confidence talk about some of these things that are concerning them, but then that pastor is in great jeopardy if he counsels them to reduce or repress their unwanted same-sex attraction. So it's really going to mean that somehow, sometime, somewhere, we're going to have to stand up for the truth, and it's going to cost us, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a comment here. Thank you for all your work and your time this evening, and thanks for that. Reach out to your church groups if you'd like a webinar. We're certainly willing to do more of these. We have another question here pertaining to SOGI. So the SOGI program is already in year 3 of its implementation in Canadian schools. It's part of the curriculum in Alberta schools where children are being taught that there's no such thing as a boy or a girl. This program starts at kindergarten level with books promoted by the LGBT Association. The schools do not inform, nor are they required to inform or get permission from the parents about the SOGI program. What can we do as parents to not have this taught to our children or opt out? What are our rights to not have our child taught this?
Can I just jump in on this, and then I'll let the actual parents comment on it and the lawyer. Here's my thought, and it's a terrible thing. I agree with you. It's not a good thing. But the challenge we have in the culture of internet and videos and social media is we can't escape their worldview. We just simply can't. It's going to be taught somewhere eventually. So what's more critical is that in our churches and in our homes, we continue to share a biblical view of sexuality. And here's the key that's important, that we show the biblical view of sexuality is good for us. It's the one that's truly tolerant, truly kind, truly loving. All of the words that have been created as catchphrases, right? The idea that love is love, for example, is a lie. There are many kinds of loves, at least 4 of them, and each of them serve different needs. So by saying love is love, we've actually sexualized all loves at this point. And the next question here is on necrophilia. I mean, what you should be asking is what is a minor attracted person? That's the new name for pedophilia. That's actually a sexual orientation now. So in terms of that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ann, but I completely sympathize with your question. The key, though, the starting point is to make sure that we teach sexuality from a biblical perspective to our kids as soon as possible.
So I resonate with what Jojo is saying, but I also would say, and I said this when I wrote Closing the Floodgates, parents unite. You have to come together as a unified front. And it's like going to your MP, the pastors going to their MP and talking to them. We need to actually en masse start speaking up, parents and grandparents. And I mean, some of that's happening. I think parents have just been so busy that they have been caught unaware, and they've let this all slip for the last 20 years. It's not anything new. So I think we need to do both. We must teach sexual ethics at home, but we also need to stand up for those children, all of the children, who are just being indoctrinated with this horrific agenda, and it's changing. It's destroying their lives now. We have to do something. So politically, that means, you know, knocking on your MP, your MPP's door. You need to be able to send him, her emails, do things, start speaking, and sharing your concerns.
Andre, you want to chime in at all, or should I move on?
Yeah, so I just add, I guess, you know, as far as your rights go, you know, it's complicated, but you certainly, you know, build relationships with the teachers of your kids. Keep it friendly. Try to, you know, be intentional about reaching out, checking in. You know, if at all possible, pick your kids up from school and try to talk to the teacher at least a few times a week. You know, and also the other thing is, like Jojo mentioned, and that made me think of it. Jojo said they're going to be exposed to this this worldview one way or another, and some of the interesting studies, horrifying studies coming out, like the Lisa Littman study, for example, about rapid onset gender dysphoria. They're not being taught that at school so much as they're discovering it in chat rooms and YouTube videos and Reddit streams and Tumblr streams and so on in social media at home in their own home, and parents are being completely surprised when their 13-year-old child quite suddenly comes out as being no longer female but identifying as male, and they're getting these ideas, you know, on their own computers sitting in their parents' home. So I think a lot more work needs to be done by parents, you know, right around like trying to not control, but at least filter and help the child filter through a proper biblical lens that all of the inundation of information that they're getting. So,
and sorry, just one last quick point. But that means, as parents, as adults, as youth pastors, that means we need to know what a biblical view of sexuality is.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of, yeah, we did it in a seminar, we had a education on it, but to really learn how to talk about it and to be able to talk about it in a way that's life affirming. So that's something, again, that we really have to start teaching ourselves. That's what we try to help churches do, but it's critical that we start with us so that we can educate our kids.
I'll just very briefly add on to this. A principal or former principal of a school, governments often put out, you know, surveys. You know, what do you want to see taught in school? What do you think about what we're teaching? And you really need to chime in on things like that. So that's another factor as well. Another question here: would Bill C-6 criminalize webinars such as this? And I can't help but think of how I open when I talk about gender confused and struggling and suffering. I think my short answer would be yes. I'm going to add to the question, would it also mean that, so that there's the 5 of us or 4 of us talking here, does it mean that the 90-some people who chimed in on the webinar could also technically be charged too? So I'll just add to that question.
Yeah, so it's just you 3 that are criminal. Everything I said was okay. So giving legal opinions on the legislation is not covered, but you know, Jojo seemed to be very much promoting a positive experience he had with pastoral counseling while he lived in Ottawa. Dr. Ann Gillies, same thing. You know, so there's at least promotion of it. Some of the things that Dr. Ann was talking about in relation to change and so on, that too could be considered advertising and so on. So it could cause a police investigation at the very least. I'm not sure the attendees would, because you're just passively observing, but if any of these attendees said, oh, you know, you got to check out Dr. Ann Gillies, sounds like she's the person that can help you with all these kinds of things, well, then you're promoting, and that's would be criminal under the promotion of conversion therapy ban.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll move on to the next one. If Bill C-6 discriminates against a sexual minority, for instance, gender dysphoric, etc., isn't that against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms pertaining to sexuality? So maybe a legal question for Andre again.
Yeah, possibly. And there's an interesting, Jojo, actually, would you want to talk about that? I'm not sure if it's public yet or not, but there's some talk about possibly challenging this along those lines, but
yeah, I'll have to be careful what I say here, but the problem is all of the people like Chris Wasson, I showed the video of him, has been telling all of these city councilors and elected officials that this bill, this ban would survive a constitutional challenge because religious groups will be challenging it on the grounds of religious freedom, but there are legitimate restrictions on religious freedom if you're going to use it to torture people. So you'll win that court case. But as I mentioned, in Calgary and many other places, and some of the MPs as well, simply deny the existence of people who want this counseling. So what they're not talking about is people like myself launching a lawsuit, being able to say we are being discriminated against based on our sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious faith, which are all charter protected traits. And I don't think they're preparing for that as much as an organization launching a human rights complaint or a lawsuit. And again, Andre's a legal expert here, but the arguments we're laying out here are not being heard by MPs. That this would allow for direct discrimination based solely on your sexual identity or sexual orientation. I mean, think about it, I'm a youth pastor as well. So if one of my youth comes to me and she says, I want to sleep with my classmate, the first question I need to ask is that classmate female or male? Because if it's male, I can say, well, look, you're underage. The Bible says you shouldn't have sex before marriage. But if it's female and I tell her, no, you can't have sex with her because you're underage, that would be reducing non-heterosexual behavior for a minor. And so even if in that kind of situation, because if it was in a counseling session or me doing my pastoral role, that could be in legal jeopardy, right, Andre?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's this point raised in this question it's a good one, and I think it needs to be explored. So and there's already certain lawyers thinking about that. So.
Okay, thank you. Another one. Does it count as conversion therapy? Oh, I just got rid of it. Scroll up here. Does it count as conversion therapy if I would advise a friend who is struggling with same-sex attraction to talk to her parent about her struggles? And if it would be a criminal offense for me to advise a friend, how would the friend be able to get help?
Yeah, I don't think it would. I think, encouraging a friend to talk to their parents wouldn't quite rise to the level of a criminal ban. I think that I would be really surprised if that would result in any charges. May be an investigation, but probably not even that. But on the second part of that question about the advising your friend to get help, like let's say you say, well, I know this Dr. Ann Gillies and I actually have her contact information and maybe you should talk to her. That would be a whole nother question. That could come to, when I talked about the offense, like the aiding and abetting and so on, it could fall under that. So so then if that's a criminal offense, how would the friend be able to get help? Well, that's the big problem, isn't it? That as much as Justice Minister Lametti says, well, the charter says that like we'll have to make room for consensual counseling between adults. Okay, but if you've removed any way for those people to be able to make contact, like there's all kinds of charter issues there. So so the bill is problematic on so many levels, but on that point as well.
Yeah, and maybe I could just jump in as well. That actually answers the second question too. If you offer or give information for a counselor, that's definitely a violation of the law. Simply articulating your beliefs or your worldview is not a violation of the law yet. But remember, the problem we have is it's a complaint-based process. So someone sitting in your pew, say you have someone as a guest who you invited to church, and she hears a sermon on Romans 1, just like with the video that I showed. And there's discussion there about what homosexuality is and that we want to discourage the practice. And particularly we want to advertise counseling services or help that the church offers for anyone who struggles with this. That could now be considered conversion therapy. And the person who's the guest at your church could then launch a complaint and they would be filing a criminal complaint at that point. So it's not simply if someone says, asks you homosexuality is sinful, it's the process that comes after that, where you want to act on that belief, or you want to encourage people to act on that belief. That could potentially be criminal.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so Jojo, you addressed this one here. If someone asked me if homosexuality was a sin and said yes because it is, would that be considered criminal? I thought I would just maybe mention, and you can maybe elaborate on that. Perhaps rather than answering yes right away, would be a more winsome approach would be to ask the person to define what they mean by sin, and then you can get into talking about sin and about grace, just rather than talking about one sin. This is what I get when I hang around Jojo, a Christian apologist, a lot. So I don't know if you want to expand on that one, but I certainly don't want to come across we're going to say no, it's not a sin. But there's, I think, a far better winsome way to approach a question like that than just a one-word answer. If you can elaborate on that.
Well, the point is that we're all supposed to be apologists. We're all supposed to be giving a defense for our faith, right? That's all our jobs. So the more we learn and integrate that in our daily practice, as we should be, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, then you don't have to hang around me as much as I'd love that. You can hang around yourselves and others. That's what's critical here. And that's why I so believe the solution is worldview training. We really need to get back to the basics of what we believe, to know that what we believe is both true objectively and good objectively. And that's what's going to protect your kids. That's what's going to protect you in conversations. If your motivation is always about how do I love this person the way Jesus wants me to, then that will help you navigate through your conversations.
All right, nicely done. Question for Mr. Ruba. Could you please clarify what the intent and scope of the proposed Angus Reid poll would be? What feedback are you seeking to gather via this poll?
Again, I would encourage you just to chat with me. I want to be careful what I share here, but the idea would just simply be to help Canadians know how many people have actually been helped by counseling. Right now, the LGBT activists are saying 20,000 gay men have been harmed by a conversion therapy, and that's why we need to ban it. It's still happening today. The problem is when you actually look at their own study that they post on their own websites, it's all public. The people that they've interviewed for these polls or studies are men they meet at gay dating websites, gay bars, or gay advocacy organizations. So people like myself who are not part of those groups are not being interviewed and they're not being counted. And people who get support, who see Dr. N to reduce non-heterosexual behavior, are doing so because they don't want to come out publicly with that. I mean, let's be honest, it's painful to talk about this. I don't like talking about this. But I'm here because I want people to know in this audience, maybe some of you may know people who've gone through this counseling. That counseling will no longer be available to you because this is not information that's being shared publicly. So I'm hoping this poll will actually capture that there's plenty of people getting this kind of support, because there's many, many reasons why you may want to reduce any kind of sexual behavior, as we mentioned. Adding that phrase really broadens the control the government has over our sexual behavior. It's really dangerous.
Okay, thank you. Next question for, sorry.
I'm wondering if I can, this maybe is not quite in answer to that question, but I was wanting to share this at some point tonight, that I just read today that there are 17,000 detransistors on one Reddit, as a group, on one Reddit group. So that's incredible. I had no idea that we had quite that many. And I mean, that's not in Canada, that would be more international, but we need to understand that people are looking for help, whether they are same-sex attracted or whether they have gone through transitioning or in the middle of it, or now detransitioning, and these people need help and they are not allowed to get help either. And it's like, wow, this is something that our government is really, they're just really not only asleep at the wheel, they're steering this ship into destruction.
Okay, question here for Anne and for Andre. Isn't all counseling a form of conversion therapy? How is compulsive sexual addiction any different from a compulsive gambling or drug addiction? It seems that the logical conclusion is that eventually all counseling will have to be criminalized. Am I on the right track that this is a good argument to use?
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say this. I think there's a difference in terminology. All counseling is change allowing counseling. I think conversion is a word, it's a theological word. You know, it's the gospel that you know, we convert our minds, if I would say that, to agree with the gospel. And so I think you're right that it's all, therapy is about change. I think it's more a theological concept that conversion is talking about, though. Anyways, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'd go with what Dr. Ann says on that. So.
Okay, question here about sharing the webinar. We will be sharing it, but only privately. So if you want the webinar, there'll be a follow-up email after this one. And if you would like to see it again or have somebody else watch it, they'll have to request, and it can only be done privately. As I mentioned, though, we are willing to do the webinar again if there's interest out there with other church groups, including our Reformed churches as well. Next question, how does this proposed bill affect parental rights in the homeschooling setting?
I don't think the concern will be as immediate in the homeschooling setting, but like, so Jojo said it a couple of times now, and I'm going to repeat it, is that with this bill, it's going to be complaint driven. So, you know, I don't think we'll see, at least not in the short to midterm, we're not going to see police doing random investigations here, there, and everywhere to see if you're doing conversion therapy. It's not the way it's going to work. It's going to be on a complaint basis where the police will get a phone call, an anonymous tip or whatever saying, oh, I think that's happening there, and this is what I heard, or this is what I saw, or this is what I experienced. And then the police go investigate. So homeschooling probably is going to be lower down on the list. But that being said, you know, homeschooling organizations that are bigger or broader, particularly where as this gets older, as this bill gets older, let's say 10 years from now, and you get a couple of kids that are now in their mid-20s, let's say, and they have a complaint about the way they were treated either at a, you know, homeschooling collective or co-op or something event, and they make a complaint. Well, maybe now the investigation is going to happen. So it's the thing with criminal law is, you know, there's no statute of limitations. Like, you can complain 40 years later about something and it will be investigated as best they can. So, yeah.
And André, I mean, you're the legal expert, but isn't it also true that if you're a parent and you have a conversation with your neighbor about what you're teaching your kids in homeschooling, and it's about reducing non-heterosexual attractions or offering support or prayer or any kind of you know, practice, treatment, or service, your neighbor could be the one to complain.
That's right.
So that's also a possibility.
Yeah, that's right. Like I mean, people who are on this call that are, you know, tight with or doing homeschooling, you already know that there's enough people that think it's strange to do homeschooling. So if you have a neighbor that's already thinking that and thinks you're strange to do homeschooling, they might be that type of person to make a complaint, right? So, yeah, good point, Jojo.
Okay, next one. My daughter's grade is just beginning to go through the identity project in her Bible class. This is a faith beyond belief organized thing, I think. Would this be disallowed under Bill C-6 if it passes?
I think there's fear it is, but we don't offer counseling. We're just going through a biblical worldview on sexuality and gender. Now, I'll turn it over to André in terms of the legal aspects, but let me just say this. It's wonderful you're taking the project. Talk to your daughter, take it with her. I mean, that's great news. But the danger, again, is not whether or not the project actually is conversion therapy. It's what people will complain it as. And that's why it's important for you to know what's going on there and what's being taught. At the end of the day, frankly, and this is just, you know, my personal opinion, if they were to go after us for our identity projects, we're the last group they should be going after. Andre's the last group they should be going after, because we're the ones who are most prepared to handle that. And we have all kinds of legal support and advice, and they would look really bad going after a Christian project teaching Christian kids how to view Christian sexuality, right? That's not what they want in the media. So, but Andre, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I agree with what Jojo just said, and again, with that complaint-driven process, that's the way it's gonna play out. On that point, though, you know, if a complaint is made against you, you got to remember that even if it doesn't rise to the level of a criminal conviction, right? It's the process is the punishment, right? And the other side kind of knows that. You know, in a lawsuit, if you know, Jojo insults me and I want to sue him for hurt feelings, or want to sue him for, you know, libel or slander, well, I got to pony up a lot of money to bring a court case. And even if I win, it's going to take a lot out of me to take Jojo to court. Even if I win and he has to pay some of my costs, I'm still going to be out a little bit of money. It's a long drawn out process, and I'm really invested in the process. With a criminal complaint, if I'm the one making the complaint, I don't have to pay anything. It's the police that are going to investigate. It's the Crown, who's paid by your tax dollars, who's going to prosecute. And even if you're vindicated in the end from a criminal charge, even if you win, you don't get your costs. You have to pay for that defense lawyer with however much money it costs to defend yourself. And even if you win, it's not like you get costs out of the deal. You've just invested whatever it is, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 to defend yourself. And if you win, great, money well spent, I suppose. And it's that whole process is the punishment in a lot of ways. Again, a lot of people think, well, in fact, we heard this at the Justice Committee, when this bill was being studied by the House of Commons Justice Committee, said, well, you know, where there's ambiguity, we'll let the courts sort it out, or we'll let the courts give clarity. Well, with all due respect, it's not. So first of all, you know, that just that whole process, and it's a punishment as it is. But with all due respect, it's not just judges who interpret the criminal code. It's going to be children's aid societies who interpret the criminal code. It's going to be public school teachers who interpret the criminal code. It's definitely police officers who are interpreting it. It's your neighbors and your boss and your everybody else in this society. They're going to hear conversion therapy is illegal. They're going to look at this big, broad definition and think, oh, that must be really bad. Okay. And wherever they see it, they're not going to be thinking through a charter analysis and whether or not that's overbroad or not. They're going to say, oh, it's criminal now, and it's going to impact on everything. Like my wife and I, we've adopted a daughter. We've gone through the CAS process, the Children's Aid Society process. If this bill passes, it's going to impact big time that sector of society. We haven't even begun to talk about that aspect. You know, public schools you can bet like that there's going to be activists and others, you know, giving professional development lessons at PD days for high school teachers and elementary school teachers, you know, signs that your students are being subjected to conversion therapy, or you know, 10 hot tips for catching that in the kids that you teach, or whatever. Like that kind of stuff is going to develop in the coming months and years, I think. So it's a bigger deal than we think. It's not just that we're going to get investigated by a police officer and then prosecuted by a lawyer and then a judge. It's going to be a bit bigger than that.
And Andre, you might as well comment on it. Mary Lou's asking in the comments section, Ed, can you comment on the possible effects of the bill on teachers and Christian school organizations? Because that ties into what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, certainly within the public systems, I think it's gonna be, you know, problematic, where you know, certain teachers in particular are going to be eager to be investigating themselves into this kind of stuff and reporting and whatnot. But I think with Christian schools and Christian teachers, yeah, again, it goes back to practices that are designed to reduce certain things, right? So even take something like, you know, some Christian schools have a dress code for girls and boys that are different for girls and boys. They differentiate the sexes. Is the insistence on a dress code for girls and boys at all ages within the school, is that the reduction of non-cisgender gender expression? Yeah, it is on the face of it. That's going to be a problem. What about the use of restrooms and showers and change facilities and sports teams, and anything that's sex segregated is going to be become an issue. And then, you know, I think it's a gray area, but the teaching of Christian ethics around sexuality, you know, is just the teaching rise to the level of conversion therapy? I don't think so. It's certainly defensible if you were charged. But then there's that whole question about, you know, being within a community where there's this expectation of how to, how to live out that aspect of your life, you know? So, you know, yeah, all around, Bill C-6 is a bad bill, and it's going to impact on many aspects of society and lived life together. And so that's why the church needs to hear the urgency in what we're saying here, that we need to speak out on this. And I really like how Jojo has framed it. It's not just to make life easier for us and stick up for our own rights. That's actually not our primary concern. Our primary concern is that, in particular, children, but also adults who do have these deep questions of identity and belonging and so on, that we need to be able to offer them help, and they have a right to get that help from different sources. So
I think, just tagging on to the schools question too, this is a principal again of a Christian school. You know, you can have kids that show up and with their parents or would ask for Christian counseling, and without Bill C-6, you would say, "Hey, I've got your back. I'm here to help. Yes, here's some people that you can reach out to." And if you have Bill C-6, it puts a chill into that. I think another thing I thought of too, we've mentioned Romans 1 a number of times. You know, starting a Bible class with the reading of Romans 1. You know, what do you do with that? You have a struggling student sitting in the back of the room. You know, that could get a bit dicey as well too. It's gray, but it still does put a chill. I think that's the issue with the bill here. It puts a real chill into those sorts of things there. So 2 more questions. This one's a follow-up again about trying to help out a friend. So this is about, you know, if I would advise, or would advising my friend to talk to her parents be the wisest choice? And if it isn't, what would be the wisest choice? If somebody struggling is reaching out, you need to talk to your mom and dad. Is that wise? And if you think that wouldn't be wise, what's the route here? So it seems to be that somebody really wants to find out what they can do here to help a struggling friend.
yeah, it's going to be, I think, case specific. Like, if you know the parent and you know that the parents are going to approach this in a genuine and a compassionate way and so on, you know, that's important. If you don't really know the parents, you know, I'd be a little bit more hesitant about insisting on it. And then it also depends on the age of the child. I think a young child has a right to be helped by their parent. That's a natural right. And I think that it's, you know, generally speaking, it's been a sad thing where other actors interfere in the relationship between parent and child. So yeah, so those are a couple of thoughts off the top of my head. I guess before I say one way or the other, I just want more information. So I think it's somewhat context specific, but I welcome thoughts from Dr. Ann or Jojo.
I was kind of thinking the same thing, in that I want to know if the parents were safe parents. So there I'm using that wonderful terminology, but you know, what kind of relationship does the child have with the parents, and are they not particularly accepting of the expression of sexuality, but accepting of the child as the individual, and then deal with the issue separately. And yeah, so you really have to know a little bit more about that situation, I think.
Ed, I apologize to you and everybody else, but the last bus out of downtown Ottawa is leaving in about 4 minutes. So I do have to run if I want to. Otherwise, I have to walk home, and there's a curfew in Quebec right now, and I'll probably get arrested. So
you can't buy a dog at this time of night.
That's right. It's really difficult to buy.
Hi, Andre.
I explain that joke to everybody else, but I'm going to duck out. It's been a pleasure to be on here. Thank you so much, Dr. Ann and Jojo, and my apologies for leaving as abruptly as I am. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
Get home safe.
Okay, we're gonna hang in here for a bit. I'm gonna quickly answer a kind of a housekeeping question here before we go back to the other one there. Could this webinar be available for pastors, elders, and how can we pass on to them? So again, there'll be a follow-up email after this webinar. And if you do want to watch it, there'll be a private link sent. So just reach out to me. The follow-up email will have my contact info, and you can reach out to me and we will make that happen. Another option is I'm certainly willing, I'm sure Jojo is willing as well, and others, and to also host a Zoom call or a webinar for any concerned pastors and elders and church leaders, especially if they just want to meet and just have a question and answer session. So last question.
And can I just add quickly
Yeah,
on
you
that?
bet. Sure.
We would be glad to work with ARPA as well to put on the seminar that we're putting on Grand Prairie this weekend, where we're actually going through the impact of the law and what you need to prepare for. You can find a description of the 4 presentations we're doing on the Free to Care website under seminar. And I'd be glad to work with Ed with your church to make that happen. So preparation is key now. So that's a good question.
All right, can you all hear me? My computer says I'm not online anymore. But
No, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, last question then. Is it correct to say this bill will directly or indirectly make the conversion of homosexuals to Christianity illegal in Canada? This should be able to be challenged in court, right?
You know, this is really interesting, that that comment, because about a year ago I made a presentation in Calgary, and I named the presentation "Banning Conversion." And I think when you were talking about that, the ultimate goal of the activists is exactly that. That because, you know, when people are converted to Christ, they change, and then they leave the community, and there's a whole aspect for people. And I think that part of this whole activist agenda is definitely that. And it's not just banning homosexuals from conversion. It's going to be about banning conversion in the church. Like it's all about the gospel and banning the gospel and reading. Basically, if your church preaches only grace without truth, then you're going to be okay, right? You know what I'm saying? And I'm all about grace, but we have a loving God, and He has laws and some rules for us, and that's where the attack will come from, because there is this make your own rules society, and yeah, so banning conversion is definitely on the agenda.
And if I could just share this image. This is an image from the city of Lethbridge. I'm not sure if there's an echo here. They're LGBT activists protesting against conversion therapy and supporting the conversion therapy ban. And this is their actual sign. And there's a group that's actually harassing faith beyond belief, and their group's name is called No Conversion Canada. It's not No Conversion Therapy Canada. It's called No Conversion Canada. And so we need to realize this is a worldview issue, and being able to advocate for change is exactly what the gospel is about. It's about transformation. So if we can't advocate for change, then we are capitulating to the culture that says we don't need to change. We're good enough as we are. That isn't the gospel. So I can't speak to the legal side of these things. That's something we're working on. But I will say that if we don't recognize what's going on here, then let me make it clear. This is at the heart of what we are as Christians. And if we don't stand up now on something like this, let's not be surprised that they're going to do far, far worse moving forward.
All right, thank you so much, Anne, and Jojo again as well. And also thanks to the group here. Is quite a group that stuck it out with us during this lengthy Q&A session. I'm looking at like 22 questions I think we had there. So excellent job for all of you chiming in as well. Going to wrap it up quickly with calls to action. Educate yourselves. We have a conversion therapy policy report. It's also online, www.arpacanada.ca. Go to publications, go to policy reports. If you'd like hard copies, shoot me a note. Again, a follow-up email is going to come up or be sent to you after this webinar. Restoringthemosaic.ca, I believe Anne shared that in the chat. Freetocare.ca, that was shared as well. And our landing page for the ARPA Canada Conversion Therapy Action. I noticed Levi has also shared that. Again, please reach out to your MPs. We have ways that you can write a handwritten letter, ways that you can make a phone call, and ways that you can send out email using our EasyMail system. 3 ways to do it. We provide talking points for you. Action, please do so. Share it with 1 or 2 friends. All of you still chiming in here at least have 1 friend. So share with him or her and get them to do the same thing as well. So you'll get the follow-up email, and we really hope and pray that you will take us up on our call to action. So that is a wrap. Thank you all for coming once again. I think it would be good to close in prayer. I'm willing to do so. Jojo, if you'd like to close, you can feel free to close as well. Would you like to?
Well,
or?
why don't you close us? Ed, that would be great. Okay.
Sure. Okay, I will close. Gracious God, Father, we come before you. We thank you again so much for the talents and the gifts that you have given to the speakers. We thank you for everyone who also came on the call and for the questions that were asked. And Father, we pray that you would use us, as weak as we are, to speak up, to speak truth, but also grace to speak about our Savior, Jesus Christ. Will you help us and guide us in this? We also pray for government leaders that you would also soften their hearts and open their eyes. And we also pray for the gender confused, those who struggle, those who feel without hope or without help. Father, will you surround them in your loving arms, and also use leaders, pastors, elders, counselors to help them and guide them as well. Will you now be with us in this evening? Help us to keep our eyes focused on you, because we know that everything here is happening because of your will. You are the sovereign God and you are in charge. And so we will do what we can out of faithfulness to you and trusting you with the rest. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Take care.